Hello and welcome to International Podcast Day 2019. I am co-founder of International Podcast Day, Dave Lee, and I am proudly joined by Melissa and Paula. Melissa is joining us from Kenya, and Paula is joining us from Canada. How are you both doing today?
Very well, thanks, Dave.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited that we have connected via Twitter, and on this hour of International Podcast Day, you're going to be talking about building podcasts as amplifiers of marginalized voices. And I know you both are very passionate about the topic. And so I'm going to get through the sponsors here, and then we will let you take the reins and have at it. So really looking forward to your contributions today. So I would like to thank the 2019 International Podcast Day sponsors. Our platinum sponsor is Blueberry. They are back again this year. Blueberry is a full-service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, statistics, and advertising opportunities. You can find more over at blueberry.com. Our gold sponsor is repurpose.io. You can automatically convert your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media outlets. You can try it for free by heading over to repurpose.io/IPD. And Libsyn, a proud gold sponsor of this year's event, they are a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for all the audio and video podcasters out there worldwide. Reach your audience everywhere and on the most popular audience destinations like Spotify and Pandora. You can check them out over at libsyn.com. And of course, our streaming partner is StreamYard this year. Fantastic work, and glad we've collaborated with them. You can find more over at StreamYard.com. You can sign up for free. And finally, we'd like to thank our celebration supporters, which is Second Line Themes, Geeks Rising Podcast Network, Synth, Outlier HQ, and Focusrite. And you can head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsor, where you can get some free stuff this year from our sponsors and also some greatly discounted services from them as well. So I do want to thank Melissa and Paula for joining us, and really excited to hear your contributions and your stories and your message. And when I connected with you, your story really resonated with me, and I want to make sure that your voices were heard on this International Podcast Day. So welcome, and we look forward to what you have to offer.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. Hello, world. I guess that's how we start. And Melissa and I are really excited to be here today, to have Africa and Kenya be a part of be a part of the International Podcast Day, and to be able to talk about what the fun things we're doing and seeing in Kenya.
Yeah, so without further ado, we'd like to introduce ourselves. So I'm Melissa, based in Nairobi, and I'm a consultant, a catalyst, I like to call myself, a curious person who works in the innovation scene. So anything that's got to do with creating positive change, but largely in the creative and cultural space, because my passion and focus is on amplifying actually our voice as Africans and as a way to shaping our identity. To ourselves and on the continent and around the world. So my work in podcasting has been going on for 3 or 4 years now, just beginning, out of curiosity about how the medium was doing in Kenya, and then beginning to do research and connect with people who are the early change makers in the podcasting scene.
Great.
And Africa Podcast Festival with Paula.
Of course. My name is Paula Rogo, and again, like Melissa said, I'm a co-founder of the Africa Podfest, which we'll get into a little later. And I'm a journalist and media entrepreneur based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm currently in Toronto. It is quite early in the morning, but definitely based in Nairobi. And yes, the work I do, the things I'm passionate about are storytelling. And I do that through a company I created called Kali Media, which focuses on telling the stories of women in East Africa. And by that, I mean Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, and really offering in-depth stories about women that really showcase their humanity. And one of the ways we've done that is through podcasting as a form of storytelling. And we'll get into some of the fun things that my company has been able to sort of put together in the podcasting world in order to reach this very targeted and specific audience. And and we're really excited to sort of share learnings and all the really cool, interesting things that are happening in Kenya. Because there are cool things happening, right, Melissa?
Yeah, definitely, there are cool things happening in Kenya. Kenya is actually one of the big hubs of creativity and innovation on the continent. We've got like a vibrant technology industry, film, fashion, food, media industry as well, and quite an active population on social media, especially like on Twitter. Kenyans on Twitter are a force to be reckoned with. So there's widespread internet access, mostly through mobile, which Kenyans are using to access information, to connect, and to ask questions and to challenge the status quo in a lot of ways in our environment, which historically has been governed in an authoritarian style. So several factors contribute to the fact why we think that podcasting has a very big future here, and why we think Kenya is quite it's a hotspot for podcasting on the continent. Is one, because of internet access, and two, because traditional media has been so stifling in terms of including alternative voices, because the gatekeepers really tend to be male, older, and politically connected with the historical elite structure. Then that is not representative of majority of the population. So people are bursting right now to tell alternative stories, to tell their story, and to shape their own political, social, economic structures and environments, so that they will serve.
Yeah, and we have a little presentation to also include as part of what we're talking about. And as in, we're not sure how much, like, in a great way, Melissa is sort of giving an introduction on who and what Kenya is. Not who, but where Kenya is and what we're about. But just to be very clear, sorry, I'm trying to figure this out very, very early in the morning, present. I'm hoping everyone can see the presentation that I'm sharing. Can you see it, Melissa? Yes, that works. Yeah. And given sort of like the intro that Melissa gave about Kenya and sort of the media structure, we wanted to talk about how podcasting is now amplifying those who are in the periphery and those who have been left out from legacy media, from mainstream media, in their storytelling as well. And yeah, as Ms. Alyssa said, Kenya is a hub of creativity and innovation on the continent in general. If you're in Nairobi, there's so many things that are constantly happening, and there's always some form of movement, especially as it pertains to the internet in general. And Mel, why do you think like that's the case?
I think it's because Kenya is quite diverse. The population is quite literally diverse, just in terms of background. We have many cultures living together within the country, and then also our cities are quite cosmopolitan, and that's, I think, because of historical factors. For example, like the fact that the UN regional hub has been in Nairobi since the 70s. So, and like the UN global headquarters is in Nairobi. So that's just generally drawn a lot of international communities to Kenya. So, and yeah, I think that's what contributes mostly to the vibrancy. It's the people, and then of course the environment, that economically the environment is relatively free compared to other, neighboring countries or countries on the continent. So Kenyans, there's just a better environment for doing business, for example, or for starting up something new, simply because the environment makes it that much simpler, much easier. And there's been peace relative to our neighbors as well.
And these are sort of, and when it comes to podcasting, you should be like, why do these things matter? But they do matter in terms of just the freedom of information moving, the freedom of sort of internet access without being disrupted. And Kenya is sort of a place that is allowed for that. And also, I think when it comes to podcasting, I want to sort of emphasize the creativity and innovation part of Kenya, because from our experience, again, this is International Podcast Day. And so, of course, we're looking at podcasting in a very sort of global perspective. But from our little home, if sometimes podcasting can feel very sort of Western heavy in terms of the podcasts that are out there, in terms of even the way podcasting is moving, right? A big example, Melissa, is Apple Podcasts are a big platform on the Western part of the world, but we are Android heavy nation in a region, right? So when I know I'm looking at my podcast numbers, when I look at platforms as it pertains to listeners on the continent, Apple Podcasts are not really up there, right? And we know that, of course, Google Podcasts have launched their sort of podcasting platform. But SoundCloud is big here, Stitcher is big here, just different Castbox, I think, which is Asian-based podcasting platform, are really big here. So when you consider the ways in which innovation can happen, if you are considering a world where and we're just using Apple Podcasts as an example, but a world that moves outside the status quo, I think Kenya is a really, really great place to then be creative, both in how we consider the editorial side of podcasting, the potential money-making options of podcasting, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And I think also for us, I don't know if you want to add anything else about the Kenya part, Melissa, because I think we also want to sort of give it a more continent-wide importance as well.
Yes, I will add that from our perspective, the other countries on the continent that are buzzing, where there's quite a pulse with regard to podcasting, are South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, which also and Egypt, which also actually correlates to when you look at the data around the data on internet connectivity. These 4 countries and the countries that are technology hubs on the continent that are producing the most technology companies and most innovative solutions around tech. It's again Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana also being on that list. So there's the internet access part of it. I think on the continent there are people who are creative and have things to say, and there's that desire and demand and thirst for self-expression. But then having the infrastructure, in this case, the internet, and then of course policy surrounding freedom of information, freedom of expression, economic context is what's making these 4 countries and Kenya being of course a strong part of those.
And what is also one thing, Melissa, is also Africa and then Kenya, we're very audio friendly.
Radio is king and queen.
Yes, in our side of the world. When you consider sort of media, it comes to just sort of visual, both in broadcast visual and then sort of print reading visual. But audio has always been great. Everyone at some point growing up was connected to the BBC World Service. Radio was in a lot of ways was a way for information to sort of be passed around and moved around, whether in news or even in just sort of more entertainment, as well.
Yeah.
And a big example of that is if you look at a lot of key revolutions that have happened around the continent, one of the first things that tends to shut down is the radio.
Like in the most remote parts where no newspaper, no television signal, no phone signal will reach, then you'll have radio. Yeah.
So what happens when you have a population that is already prepared to receive the kind of content that podcasting allows us to put out there? And that's sort of like the setup of base of our discussion today. Which is about marginalized groups and the groups that are in the periphery that tend to be forgotten or even intentionally left out when it comes to coverage. And coverage can be news or entertainment in this case. All right. Again, just before we jump into that, Melissa and I really think, of course, we've sold Kenya at this point in time, but we really think that Kenya, and again, shout out to, we have some podcasters who are also presenting on International Podcast Day who are from the continent. We have some from Nigeria and South Africa, so please go check out their presentations as well as all the others out there, but we're a little biased. But we think that Kenya is going to be the center for podcasting on the continent, and so we are the co-founders of the Africa Podfest, which is the first podcast festival on the continent that's taking place next year, March 2020. And you can follow us, of course, Twitter at Africa Podfest. And the goal really, Melissa, right, is to create a space and a hub in which we can have all these type of discussions around the podcasting as a platform.
As a platform, yes. It's a watering hole where we're creating a space for people from not only Kenya but around Africa and around the world actually, who are taking part in podcasting and in media of the future, really, to connect, form relationships and collaborations that matter, ask questions, exchange information and ideas. The Podfest is our way of unlocking all this potential that we see around podcasting from here in Nairobi, and standing up and saying, Nairobi, we're here in the podcasting universe, live from Africa, from Nairobi. So we also want to connect with other Africans who are in this space.
Yeah, and also other people of color from around the world, people from the global south, people who are outside sort of the mainstream global media, to have sort of these conversations around podcasting. And actually, a few weeks ago, we sort of created the Podfest as from intuition, really.
Yeah.
Melissa had data and stats, which we'll go into, that showed that podcasting was really thriving. And, we could also see with our eyes and then sort of anecdotal as well. But really, we had an event, sort of a tester event a few weeks ago called the Unconference on Podcasting, which was sort of a small get-together. We thought it would be small get-together of podcasters in Nairobi to sort of introduce ourselves and introduce podcasters in the city to each other. And the turnout was just really, really vibrant and really exciting and just buzzing in so many ways. So Nairobi, March 2020, you would like to be there, we think.
Yes.
Okay, so we are going to actually, while we're talking about sort of marginalized groups, and how podcasting has, how they've been able to benefit from podcasting, at least here in Kenya, we wanted to showcase some podcasts that have really thrived, some podcasts that have really thrived using sort of the platform to sort of really make our case for why podcasting is a great platform and method of storytelling for groups that are often left out of sort of mainstream media.
Yeah. So the first example is the Afro Queer podcast, which is produced in Nairobi, but actually covers stories of queer Africans on the continent. So from South Africa to Sierra Leone, to Uganda, and Africans in the diaspora, really just telling the stories that have long been mistold or suppressed, and violently, at that. And so there's telling the stories, just everyday stories, but also highlighting what the reality is like of living as a queer person in the African context, which is quite hostile actually. It's illegal, so homosexuality is criminalized in a lot of countries, including Kenya. And there's currently, just to give you an example of the context, there's currently a court case, a movement in Kenya around decriminalizing homosexuality. It's called Repeal 162 is the hashtag of the movement. So Afroqueer has gained traction quite fast, and is doing very important work. And is quite a significant space and platform for upholding our freedom, for providing entertainment, a space for connection, for a community that's long been sidelined. The other amazing thing about Afroqueer podcast is that it's one of the five in the first cohort in Google PRX podcast accelerator. So
which we know we all applied for. But it was so exciting to see not just an African podcast or a podcast that's produced in Kenya, but people we actually know go all the way to, I think it was Boston, to learn really important work that they are then sharing with the podcast community in Kenya, and which is really great as well. So yeah.
So that's one example.
Yeah. And I think also with Afroqueer, as in like Melissa, you said, it's hostile. But it's the environment, but it's also dangerous. For a lot of people, it's life or death. And so for a podcast to be able to just create space for hearing stories about the queer community in and around the continent and around the diaspora is just so powerful, because as podcasters, we all know the power of stories and storytelling and seeing ourselves in media and hearing about ourselves in media. And just so the power and the work that this podcast is doing is really, really incredible. And we excited to also know them. And they also do great work outside Nairobi. They've, I know, just about to launch or about to open a podcast studio there as well, which is really important just for the ecosystem of podcasting in the city and in the country as well. So that's Africa. And if you guys have questions in general, we're going to be taking questions after this presentation. So start populating them, please. We'd love to hear from you. And we encourage you to, of course, to follow at Afroqueer Pod. Their season 2 trailer just dropped. So you want to go listen to season 1 and then prepare yourself for season 2. It's really, really great. Storytelling, and then just really good production work as well, just to be wonky about broadcasting. Okay, another one is otherwise, question mark included, so otherwise.
That's a quip. It's a Kenyanism, if you'll say that. It's an informal greeting. So it's
otherwise,
so, yeah.
How are you doing? Like, okay, and yeah. And so this is a weekly show that's hosted by a really, really great, powerful woman named Brenda Wamboy. And the show explores Kenyan current affairs issues as chosen by the audience. So Brenda is this really smart thinker who has created this podcast in which she talks about sort of news of the day, but is able to give it a very, very important context. So one thing that the sort of media space and journalism space sometimes tends to drop the ball on in Kenya for many reasons that are understandable and sometimes not, is provide context around the news that's happening in the day, context and sort of history. Sometimes news just seems to pop up as sort of without any context or without being attached to any reasons why. But for many reasons, those conversations tend to happen not in the actual sort of publication or news broadcast, but within then sort of a second tier of media conversation, which tends to happen sort of in our WhatsApp groups or other social media spaces. So what Brenda has done is now carry a lot of those conversations of context onto sort of bringing it back up to to outside of the periphery and into the main focus in her podcast. And she does that. And she does that then with experts as well. So it might sound quite simple, maybe in its in its idea, but the way this podcast is really radical in how it chooses to also approach and tell this sort of alternative social, cultural, and political views is really, really important. And you can really go right now. Brenda is on hiatus, but I think it would be a really great time to go listen to previous episodes of her podcast and see some of the really, really radical work that she's doing and forcing then other media to do based on that as well.
Yeah, and it's especially interesting and significant the alternative views that she presents, and with a fact-based and evidence-based solid arguments in a space where speaking out and criticizing government, for example, is still risky, and bloggers have been jailed for saying things that are undesirable to the powers that be. So otherwise, it's a very, very radical. It's very radical when the context is considered, and also has quite a big following. So these views. The other thing is, and again, why we are pushing for podcasting, why we believe that podcasting is a medium that's going to be one of the ways that social change happens, is because in a widespread ways, because the fact that there's so much demand and the audiences are growing around these podcasts that are alternative or marginal in the periphery shows that the people want this. And it's, so that's what's exciting. These podcasts are selling themselves really. Just by telling the stories. Yeah.
Exactly. And one thing I love when we talk about sort of alternative views, again, we talked about Kenya being the media space being predominantly male, older. And here we have someone who, I know she's told us this personally, that she specifically chooses or tries to go for example, women experts, which is a whole other animal in terms of panels and expertise in Kenya. And so it's just already radical in the story she's telling, in the way, in the views and voices that she's pushing forward. And definitely go check out @This Is Otherwise on Twitter and the Otherwise podcast as well.
Yes. The other, that's a picture of.
Yes, this is from our unconference on podcasting a few weeks ago, and our some of the great audience that showed up. And yes, all right.
Yeah, the other podcast. This is actually quite a big one. It's Kenya's most popular podcast. It's called the Spread Podcast, and it's an education and entertainment pod started by Kaz, a lady called Kaz, who's an entertainer. She's been in the music and entertainment industry for many, many years, so I think 15 years plus, and has been passionate about sex education and sex positivity. Again, this is connected to, this a similar space as Afro Queer podcast, sort of, this very hostile environment towards not only, so hostility towards the queer community is one aspect, but there's also general cultural closeness towards sex positivity and sexual expression, and very, very conservative views. And for example, just to give an example of how this spreads even through like policy. For example, there's been quite a big debate about sex education, introducing sex education into the school curriculum, and there's still a large chunk of Kenyans who are opposing it, saying it's immoral to teach kids about sex, even if it's about, safe sex contraception and so on. So our environment the context is very, very, very conservative when it comes to issues on sexuality. And so the Spread, again, is a safe online space for these conversations. The audience is actually mainly young, made up of younger people, so between the ages of 18 to 24. But could go younger, actually, is one of the questions that Kaz is exploring, going younger, because by 18, there's already so much misinformation, lack of the right information, and so much stigma around even just things as basic as period shaming,
Right.
These sorts of questions are addressed on the Spread. So audiences submit questions or submit their stories, and then Kaz curates and develops episodes based off of the questions that she receives and the comments and just the stories that she receives. That there's also guests who go on the show and talk about their own real life experiences around relationships and sex, and their own mental health as well. So it's quite it's a gentle introduction, and a gentle introduction into diving into the complex and scary world of discovering one's sexuality. The Spread is also interesting for having quite a strong, I would say the strongest offline presence. They've done, I think, 6 or more live shows, live shows over 3 years, and also this year scaled up and hosted the Spread Festival, the Spread Fest, which was a full day of interesting talks, activities, seminars, workshops, from, and very diverse. So from there was a session on parenting, so targeted at parents around teaching their kids about sexuality. There was another session on kink, and accepting yourself and embracing your kinky side. So it's very broad. It covers a broad range of topics around sexuality, and it's also very risky and dangerous in the context.
on all levels, not
on
just
all levels. So,
the conservative side.
Yeah. On year one, in the very first years, when they started, there's a regulator who threatened not just threatened, like tried to shut them down, saying that they were illegal and immoral. But then, it turned out that actually there was nothing illegal around. There is nothing illegal around what the spread is doing. But you see, again, there's this push and pull around between what is constitutional and how, with the Kenyan Constitution, enables free expression and our diversity, and how still, in our minds, mainly the mainstream still thinks, is still afraid of diversity and of openness, and still thinks very conservatively and thinks talking about sex is immoral, and what's considered moral or immoral is it's a very dicey topic, again, because of being in such a diverse country, living with such different views. So the spread was almost shut down.
Yeah.
Controversially, it was on the media and so on, and now operates actually in this space where, yes, everything that the spread does is legal. However, there's always this sense of, you never know, like someone might decide to harass them, disrupt the events. So it's radical, basically. But then again, people go, like the tickets sold out. The tickets always sell out, actually.
Yes.
And the best tickets sold out. People want this. People desire this. So it's an unstoppable movement. And also, another interesting bit about the spread is that there's since been starting this year, Kaz started a TV show on Deutsche Welle, around the same theme. So it's basically a TV show version of the podcast, which is really exciting. So it's scaling as well, and reaching a wider audience. And, so both on the ground with young people en masse, and then also, on TV to an international audience, being Deutsche Welle, an international broadcaster. So yeah, the spread is quite interesting. Follow the spread at the spread pod on Twitter.
Yeah. I do want to add, though, as in one thing that's really exciting about the spread in terms of like a study and a case is, first of all, their numbers are incredible. And of course, when you talk about sex, you get good numbers. But I want to move sort of beyond that in something you referenced before, Melissa, is that there's a need and an interest for this type of information at the end of the day, whether because, again, it's not being provided in the education system. It's discussions do happen in sort of quiet corners when it comes to sex. And here she's talking about sex positivity, information we need to know as sexual beings. And so I think it is the largest podcast in Kenya in terms of numbers, I think by far. And then also, so I think they recently crossed 500 million listens, which is huge. Sorry? Yeah, sorry, 500, not 500 billion. Take out a few zeros. 500,000 listens, which is really, really huge, and just says a lot about what could potentially happen with the podcasting space. And then also in terms of like regulation, as it pertains to sort of marginalized groups and marginalized subjects, is podcasting as of right now does not fall under any regulation. Within the Kenyan context as of right now. And so that's why it allows for the Afro quiz and the spreads and the otherwise to sort of be out there, because if the spread had been in any other form, it could have easily been shut down. Very, very easily been shut down. And podcasting,
if it was radio, for example, or TV, it just wouldn't even have ever gone on air.
Right. And the powers that be, whether it's sponsors, whether it's government, whether it's whatever, the spread is able to live outside that space and just be really direct to the people, and the people want more, so it still exists to this day. So like Melissa said, please go follow the spread. And then
That's a photo of one of the live events, live shows of the spread. So you see, like, house full. That's about half the house. Picture of half the house.
Yeah.
Entertainment, yeah, and just like a diverse, quite a diverse audience.
Mm-hmm. And then also, sorry, with the spread, it's also interesting, like you mentioned the Deutsche Welle shows, the opportunities, we're now slowly starting to see the opportunities that are coming from having podcasts for moving outside, having a podcast that can again offer you opportunities outside the actual podcast itself. Whether it's branding, whether it's actual other potential money-making opportunities. I know there are a couple of sessions on International Podcast Day about this thing in particular. And so CAS for us, as people who are invested in podcasting and invested in sort of where it could potentially go, really gives us hope, I guess, for podcasts. And then the last one is a podcast network. It's actually a podcast network under my company, Kali Media. I mentioned earlier that Kali Media is a focus on telling the stories of women in East Africa. And so when we were sort of doing research on what are the different ways that we can transmit that storytelling to as many women and distribute these stories to just a larger population of women, podcasting, of course, came up for us for the many reasons we've mentioned already in our presentation. And so for us, the key thing, why we focus on women and why we're focusing on women in the region, and why it's mostly millennial and Gen Z and whatever that generation under Gen Z is that we're still trying to sort of think. Why we focus on them is because the general coverage in all forms of media of women in the region is in many ways subpar. Coverage in terms of the type of stories that get told, how they get told, who gets to tell them, really just leave women outside a lot of that decision making. And so with Kali Pods, again, it will be Africa's first podcast network in which we will have women-led podcast or women-focused podcasts. And it's something that we're building at this point in time. It's launched with 2 podcasts, one of which is my own, and another sort of live show podcast that we have out there. And we're currently in development with a couple of podcasts. And so what we're doing is not just, is really actually talent scouting for new voices, new ideas, new forms of storytelling in the work we're doing, and then developing those ideas and voices for podcasts. And so there's some really exciting ones that are one can expect to see in 2020. And topics include everything from politics and news to hair to lifestyle to just the ranging topics to finance, personal finance, things that we as East African women really, really care about. So it's niche, super, super niche, but we understand that podcasting is a platform that allows for that sort of niche storytelling. So you can go check out Kali Pods, or you can go to @Kali_media, or just check out Kali Pods section of our website to find out more information. And we're really open to collaborators. If you're a woman who's in that region, which is Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Rwanda, who's interested in podcasting or feel like you have a story to tell and just need the support system to get there, Kali Pods is the platform to work with. Okay. Again, great. I think Melissa, you can talk best about this particular slide.
Yes. So I've done 2 surveys just to understand what's going on in the pod scene, both in terms of discovering what podcasts are out there and also what audiences in Kenya are, how they're behaving around podcasts. Are they interested? Are they aware? How do they listen, and why? And a few weeks ago in August, I released a report on, called the in Kenya, with some pretty interesting findings. One of which is that Kenyans love the big, mostly American podcasts, for example, like your Revisionist History, The Read, the ones that, Serial. The NPRs, are quite popular. Are quite popular here, and the podcasting audience is growing. So we found that a lot of people who listen so far, because it's got potential and it's growing, but it's still in its early days, right? And it's still in its early days. It's not a negative. It's in its early days. So it's mostly, podcasting is mostly urban, and with people obviously who have access to your smartphones and who would access to, Apple Podcasts or Android, or, via apps like SoundCloud, on their phones. And an interesting like paradox, I would say, or oxymoron around podcasting in Kenya is that radio is huge. Like, everyone listens to radio, but then people don't know what a podcast is. So you ask, what's a podcast? They're like, I don't know. I've heard of that, but it sounds complicated. What is it? And then you say, oh, it's like radio, but on an app. It's like if you bring Netflix and radio together on an app on your phone. And they're like, oh, okay, I can do that. Mm-hmm. So we found that we're finding and we're exploring ways to demystify in this context, in the African context.
Yep.
Apps, because it's, or just the way it's framed, the way podcasting is framed is foreign. It hasn't come from us. Yes. We've imported the concept of it. And so one of our objectives, one of our goals of the Africa Podcast Festival is to make it our own, to make podcasting our own. And we can only do that together in a room, having these conversations. Mm-hmm. So yes, so one of the finds was that, and also the other finding was that outside of the more popular pods like The Spread, the ones we've highlighted, The Spread, otherwise Afroqueer. Actually, it's interesting because these are the most popular local podcasts, and they're also very radical. So podcasting is clearly alternative here. Mm-hmm. It's decidedly just alternative media.
At this point in time, right?
At this point in time, yes. Audience that's building, that's going to build podcasting as a medium is the alternative, is the left, the alternative audience, which is interesting. The other thing we found is that a lot of the podcast fans, so people who listen to podcasts quite frequently, also aren't aware of the many local podcasts and that increasing number that exist. Mm-hmm. So that's also an interesting problem there that we have committed ourselves to exploring and resolving, or helping resolve.
Because
you can
discoverability.
I
was going to say discoverability in general is for podcasting is of course a thing that we all know worldwide. But then what happens when the podcasts that are discovered are not local? So again, like she mentions, the big NPR podcast, Serial, sort of the ones that are just very famous in the US context, and I guess now global context. But then also sort of discovering our own great podcasts as well. And that's something, like you said, we're working towards.
Absolutely. So on our Twitter, after podcast, you'll find a link to the full report, the research report.
Yes, please. Sorry, I didn't mention that. Did you mention where to find it, Melissa? Sorry, you fell off.
Yes, I mentioned that you can find it on our Twitter account. We've posted links there.
And then while you're on Twitter, why not also follow myself at Kali Boss and Melissa on more of our podcasting chatterings and live chatterings and all that good stuff as well. And we know a lot. We know a lot of things. We don't know what we know as well. So if you want to find out more about the podcast festival, I know we're at this point, we are definitely looking for potential sponsors, potential collaborators in and around the continent and of the diaspora as well. Please get in touch with us. That's our email. And then again, follow us at Africa Podfest. And one thing I do want to mention really quick is we are building a database of African podcasts. And our goal there is to just get a sense of, first of all, to showcase the podcasts that are out there. I think it's important that we know each other, but also just build a database of just information building about who we all are. And so if you go to our Twitter page right now, the pinned tweet is a chance for you, if you're a podcaster in Kenya or around the continent or even of the diaspora who wants to sort of put their information out there, you can go to that tweet. That's the pinned tweet on our Africa Podfest page, and you can sort of fill a form in which we will then populate into the database, which already exists. So please also check out that database as well. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Stop. All right.
Melissa and Paula, thank you incredibly so much. It was a fascinating discussion. One of the questions in the chat room, and you answered it, was what is the best way for us to find podcasts coming out of Kenya? And your presentation just gave us everything we needed to know. And so that was really fantastic. And I did give a little retweet for your the African-based database that you're trying to build up there. So it's hopefully that reaches an audience as well. Yeah, thank you so much. I love that you're able to combine what's going on in Africa, in Kenya specifically, and what's building. I remember reading, Melissa, your state of podcasting, which was really intriguing to see just the caveats and the similarities with here in the United States and some of the differences. So I appreciate you both really coming in here and sharing your story, and I anticipate working together in the future. And I hope nothing but the best for your podcast festival that's scheduled in March 2020.
Thank you so much, Dave, and everyone for joining in to listen and take part and connect with us.
Yes, thank you so much. It was really an honor to be here and to be a part of this international day of podcast. So thank you.
Also fun. Yeah, it's also been quite fun.
It is a really great day. Yeah, and we do encourage everybody to head over and use the hashtag. And even after our event, if you're watching this as a recorded video over on YouTube, check out International Podcast Day, the hashtag. A lot going on. Connect with Melissa and Paula on social media. It's really great. So Melissa and Paula, thank you so much again for joining us. And we look forward to working together and hearing more about you in the podcast space in the coming year. So thank you very much.
Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.